Won't you dear, just turn down the light and then come over here. Let us go up to my side. I'm on the side.
Atlanta, Georgia, a populous modern city rich in culture and history. However, like most American cities, it is also rich in unsolved crimes and uncaptured killers. One of those mysterious killers from the Gate City is an unidentified slasher known as the Atlanta Ripper. Who was the Atlanta Ripper? And how was he able to get away with claiming the lives of at least 15 women? On January 23, 1911, the Atlanta Constitution reported on the discovery of Rosa Trice's body. The African-American woman was found slain under 100 yards from her residence. Her throat was slashed, and she had been bludgeoned with a rock. At the time, authorities believed that the 35-year-old's husband had killed her during a domestic squabble. However, no evidence connected him to the crime, and he was ultimately released. Unknown to anyone at this time, Rosa Trice had become, arguably, the first victim of the Atlanta Ripper. Many presumed victims of this unidentified serial killer have remained nameless over the past 110 years. But it's believed that this mysterious person killed at least 4 times as many women as London's Jack the Ripper. From the literature that's available on this lesser-known criminal, his killings began possibly with Rosa Trice, and then eventually picked up with such a frequency that he eventually started killing a new victim every week. According to reports, the Atlanta Ripper preferred to commit killings on Saturday nights. From what is known, his second victim was discovered dead on February 19, 1911, nearly a month after the brutal slaying of Rosa Trice. This victim's name has never been revealed to the public, and it's not known if she was a Jane Doe or if she had ever been privately identified. What is known, however, is that police in Atlanta noted that she was killed in the very same manner as Rosa Trice. Her throat was slashed, and she was brutally bludgeoned. Her body was located in Grant Park, which is but a short drive from the Pittsburgh neighborhood where the first victim's body was found. On May 8, 1911, an African-American woman was shot by an unknown assailant of the same ethnicity. While this appears to deviate from the Atlanta Ripper's known M.O., authorities and newspapers appeared to attribute this unsolved crime to him. This young woman did not survive the attack. On May 29, 1911, the Atlanta Constitution reported that the body of an African-American woman named Belle Walker had been found slain near her residence. The young woman was last seen on the previous Saturday night at a home on Cooper Street, where she was employed as a cook. Her sister realized that she was missing the following morning, indicating that she had never returned home from work on Saturday night. Belle's body was located just 25 yards from her home. Her throat was crudely slashed. Less than a month later, the Atlanta Ripper killed again. This victim, Addie Watts, was slain in the same manner as the majority of the victims thus far. Her throat was violently slashed and her head bashed. Her killer dragged her body near some railroad tracks, where she was left to be found. The Atlanta Journal reported that this slaying was one in a string of apparent serial killings. The newspaper even referred to the killer as a black butcher. The name, the Atlanta Ripper, gained use at this time, with comparisons being drawn, obviously, to London's Jack the Ripper. The home inhabited by Addie Watts, 30 Selman Street, still stands today, as does the railway where her body had been dragged and left by her killer. While this area has mostly evolved into a lively arts district, the aged buildings that stand remain as reminders of the horrors that befell Atlanta in 1911 and 1912. Following the slaying of Addie Watts, the Atlanta Ripper struck again. This time, the body of Lizzie Watkins was found in some bushes near the streets of Lawton and White. The location of her body was the furthest west the Atlanta Ripper had gone over the course of his presumed rampage. Like the other victims, Lizzie's throat was slashed, and she was beaten about the head. While most newspapers openly drew similarities between her death and the deaths of several other women, The Atlanta Constitution implied that drugs and alcohol were somehow to blame. This detail was shared by writer Jeffrey Wells, author of The Atlanta Ripper, the unsolved case of the Gate City's most infamous murders. Approximately a week following the murder of Lizzie Watkins, the Atlanta Ripper claimed another victim. 40-year-old Lena Sharp was mutilated, her throat slashed, while she was on foot between home and a local market, where she was supposed to have gone and then come right back home, where her daughter awaited her return. On that fateful night, the victim's daughter, Emma Lou Sharp, became concerned and decided to look for her mother. She went to the nearby market to see if she was still there. She was not. During her walk back to their home, she encountered whom she described as a large black man. He spoke to her, assuring her that he didn't, quote, hurt girls like her, unquote, before he sunk a knife right into her back. Emma Lou says that the man took off on foot after stabbing her without warning. Her screams attracted members of the nearby public, who were able to assist her. Meanwhile, a group of men from the neighborhood set out to find her 40-year-old mother, Lena Sharp. The woman was eventually found, mutilated in a fashion similar to the prior victims. Reports indicate that the woman's throat was cut so deeply that she had almost been decapitated. With the survival of Emma Lou Sharp came the validation that the white-owned media needed to hear. The Atlanta Ripper was a black man, and he was picking off women who were the same color as he. The newspapers ran the stories of the growing list of victims like sensational fodder, while authorities in Atlanta appeared to stumble around blindly in search of a man they likely had no real interest in apprehending. After all, the only panic among the streets at this time was that of the black community. At the time, the United States was no stranger to serial killings. In fact, some of the most notorious, prolific, and brutal serial killers sprang up in the same decade as the Atlanta Ripper. Some of those killers included Belle Gunness, Bertha Gifford, Edward Walton, and Billy Gohl. It's likely that the interest in the Atlanta Ripper was weakened among the saturated coverage of America's many other prolific killers. Nonetheless, women of color in Atlanta lived in fear, knowing that a killer was free and that any of them could become one of his next victims. Clearly, the Atlanta Ripper wasn't done killing when he claimed the life of Lena Sharp, and the increased media attention did nothing to slow down the phantom killer. In fact, the frequency of his attacks only increased, and he was back to hunting for victims just 4 days following Lena Sharp's gruesome death. Writer Jeffrey Wells has speculated that the serial killer may have tried to kill again so quickly due to anger that Lena Sharp's daughter survived the attack and was able to somewhat identify him. However, I'd like to note that Emma Lou Sharp didn't really identify the man at all. In fact, all she could make out of him was that he was a large black man who was, quote, well-dressed. Lena Sharp's daughter did, in fact, have a chance to pin the identity of her attacker on another man, but that won't come until sometime later in this story. It could be very easy and statistically accurate to speculate the Atlanta Ripper increased the frequency of his slayings due to a common phenomena that most serial killers seem to have. That phenomena, for lack of a better way to put it, is the increasingly difficult to quench need to commit these crimes. Many serial killers experience surges in adrenaline, endorphins, or even sexual pleasure hormones like oxytocin and vasopressin from committing these crimes. And what can be observed through the behaviors of these types is that they tend to increase killing the more they find it difficult to fulfill their addictions to the release of specific hormones. This can be compared to how adrenaline junkies constantly move to the next bigger, more dangerous stunts. To complement Jeffrey Wells' speculation, the stress of being nearly identified by Emma Lou Sharp could have contributed to his need to get another, quote, fix out on the streets of Atlanta. On July 8, 1911, a woman by the name of Mary Eldell encountered who may have been the Atlanta Ripper while she was walking from a residence that employed her. The woman heard someone whistling from an alleyway near the residence while walking home. She chose to acknowledge the whistle, peering down the alleyway to see a tall, quote, well-built black man, who began to approach her quickly. The frightened woman fled from the alley and back to the home, where she retrieved a firearm, clearly under the belief that she was about to single-handedly apprehend the man responsible for killing so many of Atlanta's women. When she returned to the alleyway, the man was surprisingly still there. However, he fled when she hollered for him to put his hands up. The police weren't called until after this encounter, and thus they were unable to locate this mysterious man. Does this mean the woman's harrowing story was true? Or was she simply trying to get attention during a height of a public scare? Whatever the answer to that question may be, the Atlanta Ripper did strike again, just 2 days following the supposed encounter with Mary Yeldell. On July 10, 1911, the body of Sadie Hawley was found on Atlanta Avenue. Like most of the other victims, Hawley's head had been crushed with an object, a rock in this case, and her throat had been slashed. Unlike the other victims, her shoes were missing, apparently removed and taken from the scene. The rock used to bash her head was found near her body, along with other blood traces and footprints that led to nowhere. The shoes belonging to the dead woman were never found. By this murder, mass hysteria started to take hold, and citizens of Atlanta demanded answers. This was also the time the Atlanta Constitution stepped up with concern for the black and mixed-race women of the city. An editorial penned by the newspaper team chastised the police in Atlanta for not capturing this unknown murderer. Quote, "What is the matter with the Atlanta police that they have not found the criminals themselves and locked them securely from further depredation? Is it indifference or incompetence? Is Atlanta in need of a police awakening or of a police shaking up?" Unquote. Local politicians also began to express dismay at the all-white police force, publicly wondering why their police would be so inept as to allow a killer to prowl their streets so efficiently. This clearly lit a fire under the collective ass of the police force in Atlanta, but at what cost? Suddenly, multiple men existed as suspects in the slayings of all these women, and it seemed as though the arrests were made rather hastily, more in an attempt to, quote, "close the case," than to actually solve it. Within 24 hours of the discovery of Hawley's body, police arrested Henry Huff, a 27-year-old laborer. Huff had been seen with Hawley the night she was killed, police said, and was arrested in bloody clothes with scratches on his arms. Huff wasn't actually charged at this time. He was only being held on suspicion of killing the latest victim. However, with all of the injuries and blood on the man and his clothing, he seemed like as sure as bet as any. Upon the death of Sadie Hawley, white citizens of Atlanta started to show concern for the growing list of women who had been killed by this faceless murderer. However, their concerns were more for the dwindling servant pool than the actual well-being of the black community. Angered by the lack of direction taken by police in the area, leaders of Atlanta's black community called upon authorities to hire black detectives. Black church leaders also demanded that the governor set a reward for the capture of the killer. Their petition was endorsed by many prominent citizens of Atlanta, including Asa Candler, the founder of Coca-Cola. At this time, the public outcry and the arrests of at least 3 men appeared to put a stop to these senseless killings. 7 entire weeks passed from the death of Sadie Hawley, and detectives were likely patting themselves on their backs for a job well done. Surely one of the suspects was the man responsible, for the killings had stopped and the streets of Atlanta were quieter than they'd been all year. Unfortunately, that wasn't truly the case, because on the morning of August 31st, 1911, the body of Mary Ann Duncan, a 20-year-old woman, was found around the Blanton area of Atlanta. Like the Ripper's other victims, this woman was found slain and dragged near train tracks. Her throat had been slashed, and she was also missing her shoes. Following the death of Mary Ann Duncan, the body of Minnie Wise was found murdered in a similar manner. This woman's body was found in close proximity to 2 other victims at the time. Like Mary Ann Duncan and Sadie Hawley, Wise's shoes were missing. Something stood out from the death of Minnie Wise, however, and that was that the tip of one of her index fingers had been hacked off. Have you lost count of the Atlanta Ripper's presumed victims yet? After the murder of Minnie Wise, the mayor of Atlanta defended the city's reputation and declared that the killer of these women would not go uncaptured. Almost as soon as the mayor made these public declarations, the Ripper struck again, this time leaving his victim excessively mutilated, almost as if he was sending a message back to the mayor of Atlanta. The body of an unidentified black woman was found in an undisclosed place. She had been nearly decapitated, bludgeoned brutally, and she had been disemboweled. Her heart was removed from her body and had been laid next to her on display. Race relations were already poor in Atlanta in 1911, for very obvious reasons, but these slayings and the presumed lack of police action made things more tense. To make matters worse, the all-white police force began to express dismay toward the black community, placing blame on them for not assisting in the investigation. To clarify, detectives in Atlanta believed that the city's blacks were withholding information and refusing to talk to them. Whether or not this was true, the black community, primarily church leaders and congregations, worked hard at fundraising toward a reward, while pulling together in solidarity against this uncaptured killer. Black and mixed ethnicity women were encouraged to stay home at night and refrain from walking the streets after sundown. Unfortunately, this advice did little to quell the Atlanta Ripper. Poor race relations between the whites and blacks played a huge role in this case going unsolved. The African American community was largely untrusting of the white police force and white-owned newspapers. The city was still recovering from a horrifying racially charged riot that took place a few short years before the Ripper began claiming lives. The Atlanta Race Riot of 1906 erupted on September 22nd, when droves of white men took to the streets in acts of violence against African Americans.
In 1906, Hoke Smith ran for governor. In his campaign speeches, he blamed African Americans for the problems Georgia faced. And one of the problems he claimed were crimes against white women.
It was a time when with these sensational news articles, which were based on flimsy information at best and non-existent information, to say the least, inflamed the passions of white Georgia.
In an era not far removed from slavery, poor, uneducated white people found themselves competing for work with black men and women, which was something they had yet to grow accustomed to. Resentment began to brew among whites, as black men found themselves placed in prestigious lines of work, such as college professors, and other roles that the white man was used to keeping all to himself. Black colleges began to flourish, educating Atlanta's African American community, bringing enrichment to their lives, and therefore putting them forward as tough competition in the workplace. There were, of course, fewer jobs available than there were people vying for them, and so many whites blamed their black neighbors when they'd get passed over for employment. Of course, this wasn't the African American community's fault. It wasn't their fault that there weren't enough jobs to go around for every single person that wanted one, and not all blacks in Atlanta landed jobs over their white neighbors, contrary to the bitter belief of many of the era. Still, white supremacist politicians preyed on the obvious weaknesses of their already angry constituents, and thus the Atlanta riots happened. Unfortunately, race riots have erupted numerous times over the course of America's history, both pre- and post-slavery. The 1906 Atlanta riots were among many in the early 1900s, with it being the middle of the Jim Crow era. This period of time began shortly after the Civil War, and took its name from the offensive blackface minstrel shows performed by Thomas Dartmouth Rice. To illustrate the offensiveness of this early American, quote, art form, the name Jim Crow, as the character portrayed by Rice, came from two slurs that were used to describe black people at the time. Jim, as in jimmying or theft, and Crow, which was used to compare black people to the bird of the same name.
To put me through a civil service examination.
No, stupid. You mean a civil service examination?
Well, a man carried me in a little old room and set me down and started asking me a gang of questions.
Well, what'd he ask you?
First thing the man asked me, said, how far is it from the sun to the moon?
He asked you how far it was from the sun to the moon?
Yeah, that's what the man asked me.
Well, what'd you tell him?
I told him if he was going to give me that route, I didn't want the job.
Well, tell me, how would you like to go to work for me?
Yes, ma'am. How much you gonna pay me, I hope?
Well, let's see now. I'll pay you all your work.
No, ma'am. I gotta have some money.
You know, Cotton, I'm making making a picture called The Lion Tamer.
The lion tamer?
Uh-huh.
There ain't but one kind of lion I'll mess with.
What kind's that?
Ooh, that's a dandelion.
Now, all I want you to do is meet me at the zoo in the morning at 9 o'clock.
Yeah, with the rest of the monkeys.
With the rest of the monkeys.
Yeah, I'll bring my grandpa with me.
I want to get
These
a moving
racist minstrel
picture of you
acts,
and the lion.
always portrayed by white actors in black face paint, helped in spreading harmfully caricatured stereotypes of African Americans. Blacks were presented as uneducated, dim-witted, lazy, and cowardly. They were painted as humanity's jesters under the guise of subpar comedy and song and dance. With the easily influenced public already holding on to their racial biases, these Jim Crow minstrel acts only served to benefit racist white politicians who passed laws that segregated blacks from whites in the job force, with public education, and with voting. The height of the Atlanta Rippers' activity came on the coattails of the Atlanta riots, and during the same time that white communities were growing fearful of burglaries and other crimes blamed on the black community, even the newspapers frequently publicized apparent black-on-white theft in a way that only seemed to exploit the fears of white citizens. So it's not very hard to understand how the all-white Atlanta police force and the black community couldn't see eye to eye. When the Atlanta Ripper began claiming victims one after another, the black community did not trust the all-white police force. But the police department also did little to help the community during a time of utter terror. While authorities did little to stop the serial killer, it was the work of black church leaders and community members that brought comfort to Atlanta's women of color. With so little being done to cull the killings, the newspaper companies, the police, and members of the black community all exchanged words publicly, showing the ever-present tension that never lifted even 5 years following the Atlanta riots. Toward the end of 1911, Zella Favors was found nearly lifeless on the front porch of her Atlanta home. The woman had been brutalized, beaten, and slashed beyond recognition. She died shortly after she was discovered, but before then she claimed that her attacker told her, quote, "Jack the Ripper ain't dead yet," unquote. Authorities at the time were perplexed by the attack, which took place further north than most of the slayings in the city. They weren't sure if this was legitimately the work of the Ripper, or if this was committed by a copycat type of criminal. 1912 didn't show much more kindness to the black women of Atlanta, and the Ripper was far from done after claiming as many as 15 women before the end of 1911. On January 20th, 1912, Pearl Williams' body was found at Chestnut and West Fair Streets. Her throat had been cut from ear to ear. By this point, the apparently jaded media only vaguely compared the slaying to the 1911 serial killings of at least 15 women. Nearly a month following the murder of Pearl Williams, on February 17th, the body of Alice Owens was found grossly mutilated. The murder of Owens was directly compared to the serial killings of 1911, and it was heavily implied that she too was a victim of the Atlanta Ripper. However, Alice's husband, along with 2 other men, was arrested in connection with her death. On Easter Sunday, 1912, the body of a mixed-race young woman was found mutilated by 2 men on her way to church. Media reports described this unidentified victim as an octoroon, which was a word used back then to describe a person with one black great-grandparent. Her head had been bashed and her throat crudely cut, like so many other victims of the Atlanta Ripper. Meanwhile, around the same time as the murder on Easter Sunday, the body of another unidentified mixed-race girl was found. This girl, only identified in newspapers as a 15-year-old octoroon, was found floating in the Chattahoochee River. Like other victims, her throat had also been slashed. Shortly after the Easter slayings, the body of a woman named Marietta Logan South was found slain near Atlanta Avenue. The woman's throat had been slashed. Even though many sources claim that the Ripper's reign of terror ended in 1912, newspaper reports in Atlanta during 1913 implied something totally different. Several more women were slaughtered over the course of at least 2 more years, going as far beyond the year 1915. In short, the killings continued even with several suspects that had been caught and paraded around as vile serial killers. To further add to the case, unsolved killings from as far back as 1909 and 1910 were also being attributed to the Atlanta Ripper, due in part to the manner of death of these unsolved murders. The Atlanta Ripper's modus operandi was to slit the throats of his victims, bludgeon them with some kind of heavy object, drag them to nearby railroad tracks, and to also take body parts or shoes of his victim. To date, nobody has ever been convicted in association with the 15-plus unsolved murders. At least 6 men have been arrested in the times that the killer was most active, but none of those arrests ended in a conviction. The very first man to be arrested under suspicion of being Atlanta's Jack the Ripper was John Daniel. He was ultimately acquitted after it was revealed that police beat a confession out of him. Never mind the fact that around a dozen more women died while he was in jail awaiting trial. Another suspect in the Atlanta Ripper slayings was a man by the name of Henry Lawton Brown. He was arrested in 1912 in association with the murder of a woman named Eva Florence. Bloody clothes and other suspicious bits of circumstantial evidence were found in the man's home, which led to his arrest. His testimonies were found to be unreliable, however, when it was revealed that he too was beaten during interrogation. He was not convicted. Another man arrested in the Ripper slayings was a laborer named Henry Huff. Like Henry Lawton, this man was in the area of some of the slayings. He also had scratches on his body and blood on some of his clothing when he was investigated. However, the jury acquitted him due to there not being enough evidence to tie him to the Ripper slayings. Another man by the name of Todd Henderson was arrested on suspicion of being the Atlanta Ripper. Unlike the other suspects in this case, this man was identified by a surviving victim. Emma Lou Sharp identified Todd Henderson as her attacker on the night that her mother was murdered and mutilated. However, it was later revealed that Emma Lou Sharp wasn't 100% certain that Todd Henderson was her attacker, for she couldn't truly make out what her attacker looked like in the first place. The only reason why she identified Todd as her attacker was because she recoiled at the sound of his voice as he repeated what she said her attacker said to her. Like all the other suspects, Todd was never convicted in association with the Ripper slayings. Ultimately, nobody ever faced justice for the murders of what some people believe to be nearly 24 women. The faceless killer vanished as dramatically as he entered the scene, leaving behind nothing but the vaguest description of himself, that he was just a large, well-dressed black man. There are a couple of prominent theories that exist in this case, but none of them have ever panned out. Theory number 1. It was rumored at the time of the Atlanta murders that Jack the Ripper himself fled from London and found residence in Atlanta, Georgia. People who believed in this theory believed that it was logical due to there only being 20 years between crime sprees in either country. Depending on how young the original Jack the Ripper could have been, it was mathematically likely that he could have moved to the United States and continued killing there for a very short couple of years. However, this theory truly doesn't hold any weight and comes with zero evidence to back it up. It is correct that the Atlanta Ripper killed and mutilated his victims in a way similar to that of old Jack, but that could easily be explained by the popularity of London's Ripper coverage, which could have certainly inspired copycat killings across the globe. The second theory in this case, and as a common theory, is that one lone killer was indeed responsible for the vast majority of slayings. This theory concedes that some of the victims were likely killed by their spouses or romantic partners, but one serial killer may have killed the rest. The most common theory, and the officially accepted theory, is that there truly never was an Atlanta Ripper, and that the string of horrific killings were committed by separate people. One sub-theory of this particular belief is that one person may have been responsible for the first couple of murders, but then several copycats sprang from this, out of the convenient possibility of getting away with murder. Dr. Vance McLaughlin, professor of University of North Carolina at Pembroke, believes that mass hysteria inspired many copycat killings. Personally, I believe theories number 2 and number 3 are the most logical, and perhaps the truth itself lies somewhere in between the two. Nonetheless, this serial killer of black women has never been identified, and thus all of these murders remain unsolved more than 100 years later.